Good afternoon. We hope you're enjoying your day here with us for our BSides 2019. We're ready to introduce our next speaker, or speakers. Our speakers are Nikita Mazurov and Kenny Brown. The title of their presentation is Phishing UTF Protected Accounts. Nikita Mazurov, PhD, is a privacy researcher focusing on privacy issues revolving around data archival. Kenny Brown, CISSP, PMP, is a senior technical account manager supporting federal customers at VMware to provide cross-functional advice to ensure value realization. Kenny's been at VMware for 6 years, supporting federal healthcare accounts. In their presentation, we present a novel approach for compromising UTF-protected accounts via targeting spear phishing attacks. Neither existing phishing simulation toolkits nor phishing awareness training modules cover the particular attack vector to be discussed during the presentation, leaving users unprepared to face this particular kind of phishing attack. With the standard thinking being that UTF accounts, seeing as they require hardware-based authentication, are phish-proof, a dangerous assumption that can be harmful in causing users to lower their guard against phishing attacks. Following a general exposition of current 2FA measures, we describe a detailed attack workflow in which a hypothetical high-value security-conscious target who has not just 2FA but UTF enabled on their account is the victim of account compromising spear phishing using our novel attack. I'm sorry, that sentence didn't end, although I ended it. Using our novel attack methodology. I was chosen at the last minute. Aside from the novel target exploitation mechanism to bypass UTF authentication requirements, the attack vector also leverages new top-level domain names, HTTPS, and a back-end server hosted as a Tor hidden service, which is then broadcast over the clear web alongside a final decoy payload, with the final outcome being that the phishing page is both convincing and not readily traceable. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm BSides 2019 welcome for Nikita Mazurov and Kenny Brown.
Thank you very much, Roger. You sure you don't want to come back up and just keep giving the presentation? I'll be glad to join us. So thanks everybody for coming out. Appreciate it. Good introductions. Look forward to speaking with you guys. This is actually our fourth, I believe, BSides. Can everybody actually hear me? Maybe now? It's a little bit better. Okay, a little bit better? Cool. So again, this is our fourth BSides, I believe. Looking forward to working with you guys more in the future, and hope everybody comes back. I do see a few friendly faces from last year, so appreciate everybody coming back out. And again, let's get into this. So, U2F protected account. So what we're going to cover today, 3 different main focal points. The first one being just an overview of multi-factor authentication, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, probably implement, may use currently in your day-to-day activity flows. Then we're going to go into a more reactive overview of 2-factor authentication phishing susceptibilities, so kind of a response to existing threats. You know, there's a lot of things out there right now and how you kind of respond to it in a reactive manner. Then kind of going to the crux of our presentation, we'll go over to the proactive approach for phishing attacks. So, you know, there's a lot of new zero-day attacks out there on supposed unphishable authentication, so we'll kind of go into some, you know, how we see this going into the future and how there could be some problems. So sliding over to a review of multi-factor authentication. It's pretty straightforward. So multi-factor authentication is an access control mechanism which requires basically more than one type of thing. So for instance, say you have a password. Multi-factor would require a password plus something else. The goal of multi-factor is to raise a barrier of entry, to make it a little bit more difficult for folks to get into it, and to kind of cover the different multi-factor methods that are out there right now. There are 4. So you guys know this, but just to review it. So there's the first one being something that you know, which is cognition. So for instance, a PIN, a password, a passphrase. This has been around for a long time. The second one would be something that you have, so something in your possession, your physical possession. So for instance, an SMS text message, something OTP, be it TOTP or HOTP, which TOTP is a time-based authentication. So something like an RSA token, or something that has some limit. And HOTP is something that more banks use, not necessarily a time limit on it. So again, just a second factor you can add in. Probably a lot of federal customers out there. Don't have to explain smart card authentication, so that's something else is the second something that you have. Push notifications, we'll kind of dig into that a little bit more in terms of being able to spoof the location of push notifications. So I think Nikita might talk about that in a bit. And then U2F, which stands for Universal Second Factor, which is kind of the main point about what we're talking about. Something that's a little bit newer to the market, kind of came out when FIDO and FIDO2 started to come around. So FIDO2 is a protocol which introduced password-less authentication, so it's something that could be, leveraged more in the future, but again, it's not something that a lot of websites, if any, use currently. Any questions so far? We kind of make this interactive too, so if you want to ask any questions along the way, please feel free. Oh, sorry, and then the third and fourth one is somewhere that you are, so location-based factor. So either be it GPS or IP. I think Google Authentication uses location, kind of one of the only ones that uses it. Yes, sir. Sorry. Is there any more volume on this, or just get a little bit close? That's crazy. Okay. Okay, maybe a little better. All right, better? All right, let's go to the reactive overview of our phishing or the 2FA stuff. So reactive because this section catalogs the existing threat landscape that's out there. Something that has already taken place over the past, something that we know about, something that we can plan for, in the future. So not necessarily proactive, but just reacting to what is already there. This will in turn pave the way for a predictive, proactive approach for mitigating future attacks. So you know what's happened, so we can kind of try to use this as a building block for new threats coming down the road. And primarily focus on multi-factor phishing attacks. We may mention others in passing, such as like SIM swaps and things like that, but this is primarily the way that we're heading. And then also looking for two-factor authentication, which covers first and second factor, I can talk today, or authentication schemes, which use something that you have, something that you know, somewhere that you are, so kind of based off what we were just covering. Any questions so far? Okay. So one thing that's really important to note here, I know we're all here because we all think we're very tight on security, but that's kind of the most important thing. The people that think they're the most savvy and tech things are the easiest ones to succumb to sophisticated phishing attacks. I know that I'm very guilty of this myself. I'll see an email come across, even my company VMware sends out emails currently now, and they try to get you to catch on phishing schemes. So they have a button in Outlook that says report this is phishing. But you see it and you say, oh, this URL points to something. It's important to note that even reading the URL doesn't necessarily mean that you're looking into it. It could be what's called a homographic attack. They could use different characters that look like, the certain letter. So an O in Google might actually not be an O. It could be something in Latin or some other character that's very similar to it. So it could, while it looks, on the surface be looking to be appropriate, then it's not. So, the main takeaway here is that those of you that think you're immune probably want to focus down and double down on what we're really here for. So, kind of important to remember it. So, again, we're here to kind of cover the reactive overview of existing two-factor phishing authentication methods. Slide into the very common one. I promise if you stick with me, this won't be very boring. This first one might be kind of commonplace, but one-factor phishing. So this is something that probably everybody's heard about, what I kind of just said about the email. A user account is protected by only using one-factor authentication, so a password. In this case, the user enters a password into a phishing site, and the attacker can now access the system, being as the legitimate user. So, for instance, they have a portal up, they ask for the password, you go put it in, then they have your password, and ta-da, the key's unlocked, and you have keys to the kingdom. So this is well known, and kind of two-factor is introduced to try to help protect this and move forward in the future. So SMS-based authentication. This one came out several years after the fact, after one-factor authentication, and they tried to introduce another layer of complexity by adding a text message into the whole equation. So in this instance, the user account is protected by a password and the text message. So this is two-factor. In the case of this one and how this would get compromised, the user enters a password into the phishing site. The phishing backend triggers some automated login process into the real site. So this is kind of in parallel to what the user is seeing in their own experience. And a couple examples of tools that could be used. One's called Selenium, which is a developers-based thing that it can help test, interaction with websites. So it can run a Selenium instance in the background and parallel your efforts. And then Modlishka, I believe is how you say it. It's a reverse proxy for phishing simulations. It was something that just recently came up at Chaos Congress in, I think, December of this past year. So something more frequent. But the point here is that there's multiple tool sets in the backside that can help this phishing backend to, trigger these events. So the user enters a password into the phishing site, the fake site. The phishing backend triggers the process. Excuse me. The phishing site then asks the user to enter the SMS code. So at the same time, the phishing site then goes to the real website on the back end and then requests the text code to be sent. So now it's kind of seamless. So when the user gets it, they're prompted for the SMS code. They put it into the fake site. Now the attacker has it, and then ta-da, they have access into doing this. So aside from phishing, people in the same instance can also be vulnerable to things like SIM swaps. So, you could have a carrier that somebody reaches out to, for instance, they're asking to switch the phone number to a different SIM that they have for whatever malicious intent they might do. So at the same time they're on the phone, the attacker is on the phone with the actual carrier. They could then reach out to the customer and say, hey, we are XYZ company, we're looking to verify, just to make sure. We're going to send you a text message, ask them for the phone to verify it, or ask them over the phone. So now they have the text message that was sent. Kind of confusing. But then once they have it, they can give it back to the fake side and then, swap the SIM or whatever they have to do. Point being here is that there's a lot of different ways to compromise SMS things, and it's something that, you need to be aware of. I know that I used SMS authentication for a while now, but, after our talks and after the past few years, I've tried to weed that out and not use it necessarily as much. So it's good, but generally discouraged. So I try to avoid it if at all possible when, you're doing whatever you're doing. And then, we'll cover this one. Okay.
Let me adjust the microphone a little bit. Oh. You can just hold it. Can folks hear me? Great. So moving on to different other vectors against 2FA accounts. So we have push-based authentication, which is where the user account is protected by both a password and a push alert that you get. So the way that the attack would work is, again, the standard kind of attack path where the user enters the password into the phishing website. The phishing backend triggers an automated login process and gets the push prompt, which the user then receives on their phone. Right? The user taps yes, I just tried to log in because they're on the phishing website trying to log in. As soon as they tap yes, they're done. Right? The attacker gets access. Those of you who use push notifications may notice that the alert tells you something like someone from Tampa is trying to log in to your account. Right, but you don't see the actual IP or any more granular detail other than the city, which obviously means that any remotely sophisticated adversary, right, will rent a box that's specifically in the location that the user is in to not trigger any location alerts. Right, and so push notifications are a more recent form of 2FA, but they're still trivially vulnerable to phishing attacks. Moving on, can you just get a show of hands, how many folks here currently use some sort of OTP scheme on at least any of their accounts? Okay. You folks are all currently vulnerable to the recent wave of phishing attacks going on that is specifically targeting OTP users, and I'll get into those in a little bit. So in an OTP authentication scheme, the way that works is the account is now protected with a password as well as the OTP code, and this is either generated on a hardware token or using an authenticator app. The way that our attack chain works here is the user enters the password into the phishing site, right? The phishing backend triggers the login process. Again, this is all standard. It then asks the user to enter the OTP code. The user enters the OTP code into the phishing website. The phishing website then automatically enters it into the real website itself, and bam, the attacker has access. Once the attacker has access, this is of course known as a one-time code, right? So how can they maintain access? The attacker sets up persistent access by giving apps access to that account. So if you're using, let's say, a webmail service with OTP enabled and you want to access that mail through IMAP or through POP3 through your mail client, right? The way that you set up a mail client to work with 2FA is to set up a persistent app-specific password, right? That's what the attackers do, and then they have persistent access to your account without being prompted for an OTP code. So in other words, all they need is that one single code, and then they're in for good, right? And theoretically, this attack is not new. It was first presented many, many years ago, back when FIDO came out. This was actually as seen as the push for U2F keys, is the potential exploitation of OTP. And finally, in 2019 and 2018, we're actually seeing these attacks going on. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So thus far, everything that we have been talking about is going on in the wild, right? It has been going on for years with recent escalations and stuff. And I'll get to that in just a second. What we want to now turn our attention to is proactive attacks and in turn proactive defense, right? So all this stuff that we covered just now, this kind of background, it's old news. If you're still using OTP, you're still vulnerable to it, but the best practice has been to switch to U2F keys. This is problematic. So as I mentioned, all the attacks that we've thus far discussed, they're out there, they're happening, specifically an escalation in OTP-based attacks, targeting human rights defenders, journalists, banking officials as well. And there have been a number of reports that have come out in the last couple of months. Amnesty has one, Malwarebytes just put one out, Certfoot put one out, And the kind of the recommendation, the best practice in these reports, here we have the Amnesty report as an example, is it says you should carefully configure an option for recovery through printed codes or secondary key as instructed by the particular service. This is fantastic reactive advice, right? It responds to an existing threat and it mitigates that threat, right? And that's great. The problem is that if we're not forward-thinking enough, this also exposes us to new threats. And so what we want to present is a proactive approach, which anticipates the next level of phishing attacks. So the question is, in switching to U2F keys, what's the next possible attack? So let's walk through our model one more time. So in this case, we have a user account that's protected with a U2F key. How many folks here have that? Okay, a few less than OTP. Okay, so the best practice for most use cases right now, when you set up a U2F key, and it's best practice to the point where many websites, even when you set the key up, explicitly tell you to do this, is to generate a backup code. Well, we'll see why this is problematic if you don't already see right away. So our attack chain is a little bit more elaborate this time, but it is still dead simple and follows the same attack vector. So we start off with the usual. The user enters the password into the phishing site, right? The backend triggers the automated login process into the real site. The real site now asks the phisher to present a U2F key. The phishing backend then selects the alternate option, right, which is to enter a backup code or to use any other backup MFA you have in case you lose the key. And again, we want to stress that websites are currently encouraging users to do this, right? When you go through the setup process for a U2F key, you're asked to create a backup code or have some sort of other MFA as a backup option, right? The new projected phishing potentiality is to leverage that, to leverage the fact that you have a backup option. And so to go back to our chain, the phishing site then in turn prompts the user for a U2F key. The user plugs it in, nothing happens. The website tells them, we can't read your key. Recheck your USB port, whatever your NFC, BLE, insert the key again. The user tries it still can't read it. The website says, use an alternate option. Okay, so the user takes one of their backup codes, puts it in. As soon as they put it into the phishing website again now follows the same exact chain and grants attacker immediate account access. Right? So giving present advice in the form of reactive advisories, right, is insufficient to protect users in the future. So right now, from the show of hands, we could see that most of us are using OTP. That means that we're vulnerable to existing attacks. As soon as we begin switching to U2F, by let's say mid-2019, the next logical progression in the phishing vector will be to phish U2F backup codes. So we need to be proactive, not reactive, and not just switch to keys, but switch to keys with special provisions. You want to cover the backup solutions?
Sure. So, thank you, Nikita. So, everybody hear me better, I'm sure. So some solutions to this, to actually use a physical backup key, not necessarily a backup code. So what we mean by this is to have, an actual token. Don't necessarily keep these codes that they ask you to generate, and, you could keep them safely. But try to find a physical backup key solution for this and have a backup for your backup key. And I'll kind of cover that in a second, which is to the point of saying add multiple keys to this. So if you have the option to use a physical key, remove the backup option and then just have multiple keys that you can keep in different places. So for instance, I would have one in my book bag. For my travel stuff, I'd keep one on my desk at home for personal use, and then maybe even lock one away, which would be a third one in like a safety deposit box or something like that. So at this point in time, you reduce the need to have a backup code, then you actually have just physical keys as your backup copy, so then you always have something on you. So you're not, whenever you have a code or something that you can type into a website, you'll always be susceptible to this kind of man-in-the-middle phishing attack. So, treat all your keys like I have done here as your passport. Make sure you have it somewhere. Don't lose it. I know I've been guilty of losing one, so at least you can have another one. And a lot of these different sites, you can register with them. I know LastPass, I believe, is currently you have to pay for it. I think it's $2 a month or $24 a year for the ability to add in two-factor authentication with the actual token key. But you can add multiple ones to that. So add them if you have them. They're not cheap, but it's it's easy than getting your stuff compromised down the road. And let's see, U2F security keys without backup codes are the most secure approach, as we're kind of covering here in the whole crux of our conversation, saying, use these, don't use actual codes. And, it's if you can't do that, not every website is actually able to use these things. So try something like SMS, OTP, push, any of these other things. I mean, it's better than absolutely having nothing on your account. But at the end of the day, if you can use some sort of physical key, that would be the most optimal situation.
And so just to wrap up, so kind of the takeaway from this is that it's downright irresponsible to be recommending solutions that only anticipate attacks as they have already happened, right? We need to be proactive and preventative in the measures that we take. And yes, this will introduce user inconvenience, right? People will complain that they have to carry around keys. People will lose keys, right? That is still better than having that account compromised. You always have to keep that in your mind, the value of data loss that will happen if you don't follow best practices. And the best practices cannot be today's best practices, because when we're anticipating and predicting tomorrow's attack, these have to be tomorrow's best practices, right? So OTP is not enough. U2F keys with backup codes are not enough. The only phishing-proof approach that we have right now is multiple keys with backup keys instead of backup codes. So that has to be the critical takeaway from this. Thank you, guys. And we think we have plenty of time for questions.
How many people out there have companies that mandate using actual tokens? That most often you got to go a layer further. If you have something like
And then of those of you who said yes, how many have a non-hardware-based backup option in place?